Have you ever felt surrounded by people, yet strangely unseen? Have you noticed that the more deeply you think about life, the harder it becomes to explain yourself to others? And what if that quiet loneliness isn't a flaw, but a sign of something most people never fully experience? The story begins in the evening. Not a dramatic evening, just an ordinary one. Streetlights turning on one by one, windows glowing softly across apartment buildings. The world slowing down after a long day of noise. Inside a dimly lit room, a man sits near a window, watching the city move without needing to join it. A notebook rests open beside him. Pages filled with thoughts written at different hours, questions about meaning. Memories, decisions, moments that felt small to others but heavy to him for most of his life. Thinking deeply felt like an advantage. As a child, he noticed patterns others ignored. He asked questions that stretched conversations beyond comfort. Silence never bothered him. It felt like space where ideas could breathe. Teachers called him thoughtful. Friends called him quiet. Family assumed he would eventually come out of his shell. And for a while, he tried. The details of adulthood encouraged adaptation, faster conversations, shorter attention spans. Social rhythms built around quick reactions rather than reflection. He learned to smile at the right moments, to simplify complex thoughts into acceptable answers, to nod instead of explaining ideas that required patience. It worked, at least on the surface. Life moved forward. Responsibilities grew. Conversations filled calendars. Social circles expanded and shifted with time, yet something subtle followed him everywhere, a feeling that most interactions ended just before depth began. He would leave gatherings replaying conversations in his mind, thinking of what he really wanted to say hours too late, not because he lacked words, but because the moment never allowed them. The challenge wasn't rejection. It was mismatch. While others enjoyed the energy of constant activity, he found himself drawn towards stillness. While conversations skimmed across events and opinions, his thoughts drifted toward purpose, time, and the quiet changes people rarely noticed in themselves over years. This difference became heavier. Not painful, just isolating. He began noticing how often people preferred certainty over curiosity, quick agreement over long reflection, entertainment over understanding. And slowly, he spoke less. Not out of sadness, but restraint. The world rewards speed. Deep thinking moves slowly. Late at night became his favorite time. The hours when expectations disappeared. When the world stopped demanding immediate responses, he would sit with a warm drink, watching distant traffic lights blink rhythmically, feeling more connected to the quiet city than to crowded rooms earlier that day. But then a question emerged, one he avoided for years. Why does understanding more sometimes feel like belonging less? The thought lingered. He observed friends growing comfortable in predictable routines. Conversations repeated familiar patterns. Laughter filled spaces easily. Meanwhile, his mind kept expanding outward, questioning choices, noticing emotional subtleties, sensing unspoken tensions others seemed unaffected by, and that awareness created distance. Not visible distance. Internal distance. He realized he often understood people more deeply than they understood him. He could sense moods behind smiles, hesitation behind confidence, loneliness behind humor, yet explaining that awareness felt impossible without sounding strange or overly serious. So he stayed quiet. Here's where the plot begins to shift. One night, while walking alone beneath soft streetlights, he noticed something unexpected. The loneliness he felt wasn't caused by being different. It was caused by pretending not to be. For years, he had reduced his thoughts to fit conversations, hidden curiosity to maintain ease, chosen simplicity over authenticity. And the cost of that adjustment was invisible but real. He wasn't alone because no one understood him. He was alone because few people had ever met his full mind. The realization stopped him mid-step. Maybe deep thinkers don't become lonely later in life because the world rejects them. Maybe it happens because they spend years slowly outgrowing environments built for surface-level connection. The air felt calmer as he stood there, city sounds fading into background hum. For the first time, loneliness felt less like absence and more like a transition. But transitions are uncomfortable because once you recognize the difference between fitting in and being understood, you can no longer return to pretending they are the same, and he was only beginning to discover what that realization would ask him to change next. The loneliness didn't arrive suddenly. It unfolded gradually, like evening light fading, so slowly you barely notice the darkness until the room is already dim. In earlier years, connection felt easier. Conversations revolved around shared milestones, careers beginning, families forming, plans stretching confidently into the future. Everyone moved at a similar pace, carried forward by collective momentum. There was comfort in similarity, weekend gatherings filled with laughter, long dinners where time passed unnoticed, group messages constantly active with updates, jokes, and small daily victories. He participated fully, or at least he appeared to, but internally, something subtle was changing. While others discussed what was happening, his thoughts drifted toward why it mattered. While conversations celebrated achievements, he found himself wondering whether fulfillment followed afterward or quietly slipped away. The details became clearer over time. He noticed pauses in conversations where deeper questions could exist, but never did. Moments where vulnerability almost surfaced before being redirected toward safer topics. People weren't avoiding depth intentionally, they were protecting comfort, and comfort rarely invites reflection. The challenge grew quietly inside him. He began feeling like an observer within his own life, present, smiling, engaged, yet slightly removed. After gatherings, he often sat alone in his car for a few minutes before driving home, letting silence reset something inside him. Not sadness, just mental fullness. His mind replayed fragments of conversations, analyzing tone, emotion, meaning beneath words. He noticed contradictions others seemed unaffected by. He sensed unspoken struggles hidden behind casual laughter. Awareness expanded, but connection did not expand with it, and that imbalance created fatigue. Deep thinking doesn't turn off easily. Even rest becomes reflection. Even simple moments carry layers of interpretation. One afternoon, sitting in a crowded cafe, he watched people scrolling through phones, exchanging quick remarks, moving rapidly between distractions. The environment buzzed with activity, yet conversations felt strangely thin, like sound without depth. He realized something uncomfortable. Speed had become the language of modern connection. And depth requires slowness. The plot twist began forming there. For years, he believed loneliness meant lacking people, but now he saw something different. He wasn't lacking company, he was lacking resonance. There's a difference between being heard and being understood, between shared space and shared awareness. Deep thinkers often notice emotional undercurrents, shifts in energy, subtle expressions, unsaid feelings. But expressing those perceptions requires patience from others, and patience has become rare. So conversations remain on the surface, not because depth is unwelcome, but because it takes effort many people no longer practice. That realization changed how he viewed his loneliness. It wasn't rejection. It was misalignment of pace. Life continued offering invitations, messages, interactions, yet fewer of them felt nourishing. He began choosing solitude more often, not as escape, but as restoration. Evenings alone became grounding, soft music playing quietly, rain tapping against windows, books opened slowly, allowing thoughts to unfold without interruption. And something unexpected happened. Instead of feeling emptier, he felt clearer. Without constant noise, his thoughts settled. Emotions became easier to understand. Decisions felt less influenced by external expectations, but clarity brings its own tension, because once you grow comfortable in solitude, returning to shallow connection feels exhausting. He began noticing how often people feared silence, how quickly pauses were filled with jokes or distractions, how rarely conversations lingered long enough to explore uncertainty, and he wondered, was loneliness the price of awareness? Or was it preparation for a different kind of connection still waiting ahead? Late one night, walking through nearly empty streets, he passed illuminated windows where families talked, couples laughed, televisions flickered softly for a brief moment. Doubt surfaced. Maybe he was overthinking. Maybe depth itself created separation, but then another realization followed, quieter, steadier. Depth doesn't isolate people. It filters environments. As understanding grows, fewer spaces feel authentic, but the ones that do feel profoundly meaningful. He sensed he was standing in between phases, no longer comfortable with old forms of connection, yet not fully arrived at new ones. And that in-between space felt like loneliness, but what he didn't realize yet was this. The solitude shaping him now wasn't an ending. It was preparing him to recognize a kind of connection most people overlook entirely, one that appears only after you stop trying to belong everywhere, and recognizing it would change how he understood companionship for the rest of his life. Have you ever noticed how silence can feel heavier than noise? Not the quiet of an empty room, but the quiet of thoughts moving faster than words can follow. And what if that quiet isn't a burden, but a doorway to understanding something most people never see? The evening starts like any other. Streetlights reflect on wet asphalt. Cars move slowly, punctuated by distant horns. A lone pedestrian passes beneath a flickering lamp, umbrella shielding them from a drizzle that softens the world. Inside, he sits in a small study, a single lamp casting warm light over scattered notebooks, pages filled with ideas, reflections, and questions he has never voiced aloud. The room smells faintly of coffee and ink. For years, he had been chasing understanding from others, from colleagues, friends, even strangers online. Every conversation, every decision measured against imagined approval. But lately, that chase has slowed. The details are subtle. A delayed response to a message, a skipped social invitation, evenings spent walking alone, listening to rain or distant traffic, observing the rhythm of a city that never stops, all creating a space no one else can enter. The challenge arises quietly, like a shadow moving across the floor. Because thinking deeply comes with consequences. Awareness sharpens perception, but it also sharpens the gap between internal life and external expectation. Conversations once effortless now feel strained. Jokes land flat. Questions invite answers too simple to satisfy the mind that has wandered further. Relationships are tested not by conflict, but by patience, the patience most people rarely exercise. He begins noticing patterns in himself, the tendency to over-explain, to soften points for easier digestion, to measure responses against imagined judgment. He realizes much of his energy has been spent not on living, but on performing understanding. And that awareness brings the first twist. Loneliness, he now sees, is not absence. It is resonance. Some people vibrate on similar frequencies and others do not. Depth moves slowly. It requires attention, reflection, emotional patience. Without these qualities in those around you, proximity cannot create connection. He leans back in his chair, watching the rain streak the window. The city is alive below, countless lights, countless movements, yet the world seems more distant, as if understanding must be earned rather than assumed. That is when clarity arrives. He realizes that deep thinking is inherently isolating at times, not because it separates him from humanity, but because it separates him from superficial expectation. The very effort to observe, reflect, and internalize nuances creates an invisible boundary, and boundaries, while protective, also define what kind of connection is possible. The plot twist deepens. Solitude is not a punishment. It is preparation. Every long walk, every quiet evening, every moment spent reflecting without interruption is a rehearsal for a different kind of interaction, one where understanding is mutual, patience is present, and words are chosen not for approval, but for clarity. He closes his notebook slowly. The faint scratch of the pen on paper lingers in his mind. He listens to the rain, not trying to escape thoughts, but letting them settle. And something unexpected begins to emerge. The tension he once felt, the discomfort of being different, begins to shift into awareness. Awareness that the loneliness he sensed is temporary, a threshold. It is the space before resonance, The quiet before connection that truly matters, he notices how his perception has sharpened. He understands the subtle cues of sincerity, the small hesitations in conversation that reveal honesty, the gentle spaces between words where intention lives. These are invisible to most, yet they illuminate the path forward for him, and in that illumination lies both comfort and curiosity, because recognizing the solitude as a filter, not a punishment, opens a question he cannot yet answer. Who will resonate with this depth? And how will he know when he finds them? What if the loneliness we feel isn't a void, but a signal? A quiet marker pointing toward a type of connection that ordinary conversation can never reach. The night is deep and still. Streetlights cast long reflections across slick pavement. The occasional car hums in the distance. Inside, the lamp casts soft golden light over stacked notebooks. A cup of tea now cooled, and pens resting quietly as if waiting for inspiration. For years, he measured life by presence, showing up, being seen, earning acknowledgement. Each interaction carried subtle weight, a glance, a reaction, a nod of approval. Even joy was framed around reflection in others' eyes. But slowly, he stopped chasing that reflection. It wasn't dramatic. No announcement. No sudden withdrawal. Just a series of small, deliberate choices, answering fewer messages, leaving some invitations unanswered, sitting longer in thought. He created space for curiosity, for observation, for himself, and in that space, the plot twist arrived. He began noticing patterns he had ignored for decades. The world buzzes with energy, but meaningful understanding is rare. Most people skim the surface: laughter, achievements, distractions. Depth is overlooked, undervalued, even feared. But when he slowed down, paying attention to subtleties, a hesitation, a shadow of doubt, a fleeting expression of joy, he saw truth others often missed. The challenge was subtle. Freedom from constant approval revealed its own tension. Without external validation, some connections faded naturally. Conversations that once felt effortless now carried emptiness. Yet in their place appeared another kind of connection, slower, quieter, but richer. One that requires patience, attention, and shared presence. The insight was profound. Loneliness, for a deep thinker, is not an absence of people. It is a signal, a guidepost pointing toward interactions that truly matter. Not everyone can follow that rhythm, but those who can resonate deeply. And finding them requires patience and stillness. He stands by the window, watching reflections move across rain-streaked streets. His own reflection meets his eyes briefly in the glass, calm, steady, and quiet. The city hums around him, oblivious. Yet he feels aligned in a way crowds and applause could never provide. And here comes the realization that changes everything. When approval stops defining your actions, presence begins defining your life. The value shifts from being noticed to noticing, from being understood to observing understanding, from chasing connection to allowing resonance. And the quiet reward is subtle, yet profound, a sense of belonging that comes not from performance but from alignment. He returns to the notebooks. No urgency, no expectation. Thoughts flow not for admiration, but for clarity. The rain softens. Streetlights flicker. Somewhere distant, life continues as it always has, but he is no longer pulled into its currents. He notices a lingering question, one that will shape what comes next. If resonance is found in stillness, how long before the world catches up? Or is it even meant to? The answer is not immediate. It never is, because deep thinking, patience, and subtle awareness are not loud. They are not celebrated. They are lived slowly, quietly, invisibly, and in that invisibility lies freedom. A freedom that most people only glimpse decades too late, but for those willing to listen, to observe, and to embrace quiet reflection. It becomes a life unexpectedly rich, even in solitude, and the next step, the moment where solitude transforms into true resonance, is waiting just beyond the quiet edge of tonight.